Okay, good evening everyone, and thank you for coming to our May Wednesday gathering. It is titled Pilgrims, Myths, and Misconceptions, and we have Matt Villamaino here tonight with us. He is a longtime history enthusiast, and he became involved in the field of interpretation as a volunteer at Jamestown Settlement while living in Virginia. After returning to Massachusetts, Matt began work with the Department of Conservation and Recreation, eventually serving as the Visitor Services Supervisor for Pilgrim Memorial State Park in 2017 and 2018. As a certified interpretive trainer, Matt has taught the principles of interpretation to people from numerous organizations, including the National Park Service, Pilgrim Hall Museum, and Plymouth 400. Currently, Matt is the Regional Interpretive Coordinator for the Central Region of the Massachusetts State Park System, working with staff to connect visitors to varied resources found in our parks. So we would like to welcome him here tonight, and everybody enjoy the talk. Thank you for coming.
Tonight, we're going to talk about some of the myths with the Pilgrims, as you might have gathered from the title of the program. But first, what is a myth? There's a couple of definitions that we can look at. One is a popular belief or tradition that has grown up around something or someone, or more detailed, a usually traditional story of ostensibly historical events that serves to unfold part of the worldview of the people, or to explain a practice, belief, or natural phenomenon. So tonight we're going to talk about some of the myths in general and specific myths centered around the Pilgrims. Now, unfortunately, I can't follow the Mythbusters model. How many of you have watched Mythbusters? Raise your hand. So for those of you who are not familiar with Mythbusters, usually in busting a myth, they blow something up. I can't do that tonight, I'm sorry. You're just going to have to put up with me talking. What's that?
That's a TV show?
Yes, it's a TV show. As we'll see tonight, some of the myths have a basis in truth. Others are kind of more just made up. Can you guys hear me in the back okay?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Before I continue with specific myths, what is it about myths that attract us? Feel free to raise your hand so I do ask questions of the audience.
I think that like a myth is something you actually learn in school and you believe.
Okay, it's something you learn in school and you believe. But why do we like myths? Why do we keep telling them? Yes?
It explains something.
It explains something. That's a great reason to tell a myth. What else about myths?
It supports our worldview.
It supports our worldview.
It's a common story, so we all believe it together.
It's not only a common story, but it's usually a really good story. And humans love stories. One of the things when I'm teaching interpreters how to do talks, don't just give a bunch of facts, wrap it up in a story. Because if we tell a story, people are going to be much more engaged. And myths are stories. Now, why do they dominate our history? Well, in part because of this story effect. These myths are coming out for a few reasons. One of them is, or their origin story, there's a few reasons. One of them is a lack of information in general. So we don't know the true origin of something and we need to come up with something. Others, it's a lot like a game of telephone. So we have the truth here, and then as it passes and it passes, raise your hand if you've ever played telephone. It's not going to stay the same. And some of the changes are going to be little, but some of the changes might be big, because somebody might not be able to hear that well, or somebody has a bad memory. So when we talk about myths, a lot of time it's not an intentional misleading of people that is the origin of that myth. It's a combination of really these two big factors where either people didn't have enough information, they looked at it and they said, oh, well, this is happening, so it must be because of this. And they've either made a mistake or or they're missing a critical piece of information. Or, what's that?
Or they're a good storyteller.
Or they're a good storyteller. And they just want to share the story and they don't care.
Yeah.
When we look at myths, they can be big or small. And I like to put myths into two categories. And mostly what we're going to focus on tonight are some of those big myths. Those myths that have really, not just everybody knows them, and everybody, even if you don't believe them, but they've really shaped our society today. So that's what I'm going to focus on for the most part. But when talking about the pilgrims and talking about myths, there's a couple of the smaller myths, the more fun myths, that I can't not talk about and myth bust. The two small myths that I want to mention are the fun ones. The pilgrim clothing. When we talk about pilgrim clothing, what is the typical picture that is painted of a pilgrim? Is there none in here? If we look in the Pilgrim Hall Museum at the pictures of the paintings done in the 19th century, what is the stereotypical image of a pilgrim?
A hat with a buckle.
A hat with a buckle, shoes with buckles, black clothing, black clothing.
Collar.
What's that?
White collar.
White collar,
No color.
no color.
Yeah, I'm wrong.
But if you look at it, you gotta say, how did they live in the winter like that? It just makes sense that it's not right, to me anyway.
And yeah, one of the things with myths in general, and this is just actually when you're listening to something new, take stuff with a grain of salt. Say, does this make sense? Especially if you're visiting a museum or a historic site. If you hear something that goes, because even the Smithsonian, I'm sure, has been caught spreading stuff that they thought was true that wasn't. So it happens at all levels of museums. But the pilgrim clothing, this really starts in the 19th century. There was an illustration that somebody came up with. And it was that stereotypical image. And we know for the most part now, especially the people who are coming out to this, probably know that that is not true. They did not wear buckles on their hats. They did not wear buckles on their shoes. The grandfathers of the people who came up with this, though, did wear buckles on their shoes. Because if you look in the 18th century, especially the late 18th century, shoes had buckles. So they're thinking, well, what's old? Well, Grandpa had buckles on his shoes, so it leads to believe that the pilgrims had buckles on their shoes. There are some people that say, no, this wasn't true because buckles were expensive. Not really. I mean, they did have belt buckles. And people will do all sorts of things for style. But putting a buckle on your hat, there's no documentary evidence. And we have a lot. We only have one picture of one of the pilgrims. Bonus point, anybody know who we have the picture of the pilgrim of? One existing portrait of the pilgrim.
Oh,
Wade
Winslow?
It's not Bradford, not
Winslow.
It's Winslow. Winslow. He went back to Europe. He went back to England. Was painted, actually wearing all black, because that was his Sunday best. Black clothing is more expensive. It's hard to get the dye that dark. It's hard to keep it that way. But the clothing that they're going to be wearing is going to be all different colors. It depends on if it's wool or if it's linen or canvas, or not too many of the pilgrims might not have silk, but a lot of this is going to be undyed wool, and sheep come in a lot of different colors. And you can dye blues. You can dye yellows. There's a friend of mine who works at Plymouth Plantation who will happily talk your ear off about pilgrim clothing. If you want to learn more, let me know and I'll tell you who to talk to. But that's it's really a harmless myth. You know, we see it, it's kind of that quaint image. There's another harmless myth that we get a lot of people who think that, well, the pilgrims, they left Plymouth, England. They arrived here, so they named it after Plymouth, England. And so they went from Plymouth to Plymouth. They really weren't supposed to be in either of those places. They left from Southampton in England. And they were with another ship. Some of you probably heard of it. It's called the Speedwell. Speedwell, long story short, Speedwell kept leaking. It had to be left behind. And the last port that they left from was Plymouth. They were aiming for what was then Northern Virginia. We would call it New York today, mouth of the Hudson River. not supposed to come anywhere up near this way. But when they, is that a train or something?
Yes.
Okay. I live right by a rail yard, so I should recognize that. All sorts of challenges come up when you do talks. The area called Plymouth had actually already been named Plymouth when the Pilgrims arrived. And there's a name that's not very much associated with New England that really is heavily impacted the settlements here. And that name you'll probably recognize from the Disney movie of Pocahontas. Anybody want to guess? Captain John Smith. Captain John Smith. He explored this area in 1607 and 1608, and he's the one that named it New Plymouth. I'm not going to try and speak in a Mel Gibson voice. But he was called, one of his titles was the Admiral of New England. And he explored this whole area, and he really wanted to set up a colony here himself. He was just never able to get the support to do it. But the fact that they left Plymouth, England, and ended up in New Plymouth was just a total coincidence. So those are a couple of the smaller myths that are kind of fun to debunk. But in those myths, if people have heard them, especially the second one, they don't really affect our national consciousness and who we are today as Americans. And there's three myths that I want to talk about that really do shape our country's point of view and our whole kind of way of thinking in a lot of ways. And those three myths, make sure I'm going in the right order here. The reasons for the Pilgrims coming to the New World, that first Thanksgiving, and of course, no talk about the Pilgrims and myths would be complete without the Rock, Plymouth Rock. So we'll finish up with Plymouth Rock. Now the reasons for the Pilgrims coming over here. What's commonly painted as a reason is they're coming over for religious freedom. They don't want to be persecuted. Is this true? There's a really, really, really tiny element of truth in that. The first thing that's important to know when we talk about the Pilgrims, now there's 102 passengers on that boat, including the children, who don't have much of a choice coming over. So we've got about 30 children. Their reason is, well, mom and dad are taking us. So if we look at the adults, 70 or so adults, I think there's probably 150 or more reasons why those people got on that boat. It's not going to be just one reason. And it's not just one group of people. About half of the passengers on the Mayflower are separatists from the Church of England. They disagree with the Church of England. They think it is too corrupt. That's its own talk right there. But suffice to say, when the Church of England is headed by the king, if you are disagreeing with the king and you do this too much, that can be dangerous for your well-being.
It's treason.
It is treason. Depending on how the king wants to look at it, that is absolutely treason. They are more likely to be fined than anything else, and then they might be imprisoned for failing to pay that fine. And the reason for that is they are actually more conservative than the Church of England. And it is very rare in religious persecution that you execute somebody for being more conservative than you.
And with these Puritans,
They are not Puritans. So the difference between the separatists and the Puritans, the separatists have said, this Church of England, it is so corrupt, we have to start over. Very simplified.
and you're talking about
This is
the
the Pilgrims.
Protestant Church of England.
Yes, the Protestant Church of England. Whereas the Puritans, they want to purify the church and work within the church to change it. So life got a little uncomfortable for these separatists, and they left England and they went to Holland. And they lived in Holland for about 10 years before deciding to emigrate to the New World. The other half of the passengers on the Mayflower are recruited directly from England because not enough of these separatists want to go on the first boat because the first boat is the most dangerous. Jamestown, at this time, about 80% of the people going over to Jamestown are dying. Roanoke, the colony before that, the lost colony of Roanoke, it was Lost, thank you. I try to make it as simple as possible. We think they went to live with the natives, but we have no hard evidence right now. And so knowing those odds, how many of you are going to get on the Mayflower? No takers? Okay. I think I get, when I use that line at the Rock Talk at Pilgrim Memorial, I usually get about 15 people a season out of the maybe, 8, 10, no, it's more than that people we do that program for. We did that program, I think, for 80,000 people last year. And I maybe got 20 people, maybe. So it's very dangerous, and a lot of the separatists don't want to leave Holland. So they have to recruit extra people to go, because for a colony to be viable, you have to have about 100 people. So they recruit from the streets of England, London in particular. And these people are going to have totally different reasons than the people who are the separatists. Now, the separatists did write down their reasons. Both William Bradford and Edward Winslow wrote down reasons why they decided to leave the Netherlands and come to the New World. And they're varied. Part of it has to do with the hardness of life there. Part of it has to do with the fact that their children are growing up Dutch and they're not getting an English education. This is right in of Plymouth Plantation. I had thought about reading the original text, but I wanted to keep you awake. Bradford is very good for historians in a lot of ways, but it is not entertaining. If we read between the lines on both Bradford and Winslow, if we read between the lines and do some interpretation, my thought, reading between the lines, is all of their reasons, except for one, boil down to one commonality. And that's to have a better life for their children. Because they're willing to risk everything so that their kids will grow up in a place where they'll have economic opportunities, where they won't be in the mess that is the city of Leiden and the hardships that they're having there, where they won't be risking war with the Spanish because the Spanish are threatening to attack as a truce is ending. If we look at the people who are not the separatists, economic opportunities. That's what it comes down to. We don't have writings, but it's the opportunity to own land, the opportunity to make something of themselves and have a better future. That sound familiar?
But what an adventure, too.
But what an adventure. And some of them, especially Hopkins, may have been in it for the adventure. He had been over at Jamestown already. But for the most part, they're looking for a better life. Why does somebody leave their country of origin and go to a whole new country where they either don't know anybody or they have to set something up from scratch in this case? It takes a lot, and they want that better life. That's still a super compelling story.
It's still true in this country today.
It's still, if we look at the immigrants coming in today, why are they risking their lives coming up through Mexico?
Same story.
Same story. It does not change. People do not change. Specifics might change, but people do not change. This narrative of the pilgrims coming over here for religious freedom really starts appearing in the 19th century. When we look at the 200th anniversary of the landing of the pilgrims in 1820, there's a resurgence of interest in all things pilgrim. The problem that they have is that they don't have Governor Bradford's book in the early 19th century. It's been lost and won't be rediscovered until later in the century. They do have excerpts from it, and I don't know exactly, this is something I'd love to do more research on to see exactly what they do know, but they don't have all of Bradford's book. They don't have Winslow's letters yet. We found those later on in the 19th century, and some scholars think that there may be some more things hiding in some archives in France that were taken when the fortune was taken. And if we could ever find that, that would just be an amazing resource to us. So they are looking at why did they come, and they came up with this narrative. They, in part, are contrasting themselves with Jamestown Well, up here they came for these very noble reasons. Jamestown, they're coming over for economic opportunities, and during that first winter there's cannibalism, and there might well have been. But, you know, if you can't eat, you can't eat. But nobody in Jamestown is around in the 19th century to say, hey, wait a minute, we got to have a more balanced discussion, because Jamestown by this point had been abandoned. The settlement of Virginia was not a failure. It's still around today. Very important during the Revolutionary War is the colony of Virginia. But the actual settlement of Jamestown is abandoned by the end of the 17th century because it was built on a swamp, and they moved to better pastures. So when the Pilgrim revival is happening, there's nobody in Virginia that's catching on what's going. So you have this narrative of the Pilgrims coming over here. They're the pre-founding fathers, the Pilgrim fathers. That's when that terminology, the forefathers, is heavily used. And that myth really shapes the story very differently than what happened. We're going to talk more about the impact of all three of these myths at the end. Next, I want to talk a bit about Thanksgiving. How many people like Thanksgiving? There's some big myths and there's some little myths associated with Thanksgiving. When we talk about little myths, probably the biggest of those is their food. What did they eat on Thanksgiving?
Turkey.
Turkey! Did they eat turkey?
No!
Maybe! There are 2 paragraphs written about that first Thanksgiving. One from Bradford and one from Winslow. And we do know some of the things that they ate. They don't specify turkey, but they do specify fowl. My interpretation is that it was more likely to be waterfowl, because waterfowl are a heck of a lot easier to hunt than turkeys are, but you never know. I'd like to think there was a turkey there. The main meat that was there was brought by the Wampanoag. Massasoit and his men brought 5, I heard it somewhere,
Yeah.
5 deer, venison.
At the time, weren't they known as Pokanokets?
Yes, yes. The Massasoit is from the village of Pokanoket. Today, for ease of use, the term Wampanoag is used. I've been trying to find out, and if anybody knows, you can tell me after the program, when that term first comes into our language. I've not been able to find out when the term Wampanoag is first used. Which is really kind of puzzling to me. But that's a sidetrack, and it's very easy for me to get sidetracked, so we'll try not to do that. So Massasoit shows up. They have, and this is another thing that I think we could bring back with their Thanksgiving to our Thanksgiving. It wasn't an afternoon, it was 3 days. 3 days of feasting. At the time, there were 3 adult Pilgrim women. There were 3 teenagers of age to maybe be of use. They probably did a lot of cooking. We don't know if the Wampanoag were invited or if they just showed up. I could make arguments for either. Because Massasoit lives in Pokanoket, which is quite a distance away. So what are the odds that he just happens to be up this way with a bunch of his men?
Where is that?
Bristol, Rhode Island.
Oh,
Yes. So, pretty sure. So we don't know. There's no evidence one way or another. But that Thanksgiving is really framed as the first Thanksgiving. Is it the first Thanksgiving? Depends on how you define Thanksgiving. Not really. Is it the Thanksgiving that influenced our holiday of Thanksgiving today and shaped what we have today as Thanksgiving, which is almost more important? Absolutely. The concept of Thanksgiving is a very old one. And when we look in the 17th century at European Thanksgivings, we'll talk about the native concept of giving thanks in a second. there's two things. There's harvest festivals and there's days of Thanksgiving. Harvest festival, pretty simple. Harvest is in, all that hard work is done. Being a farmer is a hard life. Let's have a party. Let's eat some of this food before we preserve it, because it's not going to taste better than what it does now. It's nice and fresh. And then you go into the winter. You still, as a farmer, have work to do. Any farmers in here?
I used to grow cranberries.
Okay. Farming is always busy, but during the growing season is when you're working dawn to dusk because there's a deadline. Whereas maybe that thing can be fixed tomorrow over the winter instead of today. So harvest festivals have been happening probably as long as we've been having harvests. Thanksgivings are something different to the Pilgrims. And if the Pilgrims had a day of Thanksgiving here, and it's not written down, which doesn't mean it didn't happen, their first Thanksgiving would have been in November of 1620, when they made landfall on Cape Cod. After 66 days on the Mayflower, they got off that boat onto land. They had survived a horrendous voyage that went longer than they had planned. The Mayflower almost sank when one of the beams cracked. They were fortunately able to fix it. Not with a printing press, it was with a jack. Some of the early 20th century publications say that the jack they used was part of a printing press. It was not. They definitely recognized the value of printing, and there were several printers among the Mayflower crew, including Brewster, which is why the King of England really didn't like him. But if they're going to give thanks at any one time, initially, it's when they get off that boat. And a day of Thanksgiving is called for by the secular authorities.
It's religious.
It is religious. It's called for by the governor, though, to give thanks to God. We don't realize, a lot of us today, how intertwined religious life and religious beliefs were in the 17th century. There were some. You're not going to admit to being an atheist in the 17th century. That could get you executed.
The state.
Well, that could depending on the time and the place. All of these people deeply believed in something, and this is as close as I'll get to using the word all. These people clearly, they definitely believed in something. Now, there were definitely multiple different things they believed in, but they all had, or almost all had, very strong religious beliefs. And they believed in God taking an active hand in the way things were on the earth. So when something momentous happened, they would stop, they would give thanks. They would have a day of fasting. That doesn't really add up with our modern Thanksgiving. But the first Thanksgivings in the United States, or what's now the United States, there's several that are recorded before this, of both types. There is a dedicated day of Thanksgiving in Virginia in 1619, when they're setting up a new settlement there. Their charter actually called for them to have a day of Thanksgiving. The Spanish down in Florida, when they first arrived there, they had a day of Thanksgiving. Doesn't always have to be fasting.
Would that be St. Augustine?
I'd have to double check exactly. I think it was when they did St. Augustine. I don't remember the exact circumstances on that. But they had a day of Thanksgiving and a feast, and they actually had it with the natives. So we can't even say we're the first cross-cultural, because we can definitely say Virginia was just the English. But the Spanish had a cross-cultural Thanksgiving down in Florida. There's one that Texas is trying to push. It's a very common thing. But the Thanksgiving that we have today is influenced by that Pilgrim Thanksgiving. And that's because in the 19th century, you have a woman who is very much wanting to have a unified day of Thanksgiving. And this is a multi-decade thing to really come to fruition. Most presidents had declared a day of Thanksgiving, of national Thanksgiving, but it was kind of a hodgepodge. It wasn't anything really standardized. Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War is where it really starts getting much more standardized. And into the 20th century with Franklin Roosevelt. And for anybody who says that Thanksgiving and football are two separate things, we should not be watching football on Thanksgiving. Football has been tied to Thanksgiving as long as there has been football. And one of the reasons why Franklin Roosevelt's proposal to move Thanksgiving caused such an uproar is because football games had already been scheduled for what people were assumed. So some states had two Thanksgivings. They had the federal one and they had their state one. Some states kept their own and some moved it to the date that Roosevelt wanted. And eventually we got to where we are today. But that Thanksgiving was built around the concept of the Pilgrim Thanksgiving.
The Patriots don't plan Thanksgiving, so kids.
Yeah. They're too busy playing into February. But that Thanksgiving myth of the Pilgrims and the first Thanksgiving, certainly important, but overshadows some of those other things that happened. And I mentioned a while ago the natives. If you talk to the people at Plymouth Plantation and the Wampanoag home site, they will tell you that the Wampanoag and other native peoples in this area, and probably throughout the United States, I haven't done the research outside this area, they give thanks for basically everything. It's a daily occurrence to them. Because that is what they believe. So it's not even, the concept of Thanksgiving isn't even limited to European culture. It's all over. And to just put all of it on the first Thanksgiving on that Pilgrim Day in 1621 really kind of does disservice to the rest of those. Now, the last myth I want to talk about, of course, is Plymouth Rock. And we all know the story. In 1620, Pilgrims arrive in Plymouth Harbor. They pull their boat right up next to that rock. I'm usually saying this next to the rock. They get off the boat. They get onto the rock. They get off the rock. They get onto the beach. Welcome to the New World. Now, they had landed on Cape Cod a month before that. So their first steps in the New World are 100% not on that rock. I can say that completely unequivocally as a historian. Did they see the rock? Let's go from the other direction. I can say with reasonable certainty that they saw the rock, because the original settlement is only about 500 feet from Plymouth Rock. It's Wyden Street today. Although the plaques, modern research is suggesting the plaques may all have to be shifted one way or the other, because Main Street might not be where their Main Street was. That's something for the other historians to worry about. I'm not going to worry about that one. And the concept of the Pilgrims stepping on Plymouth Rock, and we have some small myths associated with this as well. Who's the first person on Plymouth Rock? Who are the two contenders? Can anybody tell me who are the claimants?
Elizabeth Tilly. Well, there was talk of her being...
Not Tilly, but it was one of the teenagers, the teenage girls.
I should know this.
Begins with a C. Last name begins with a C.
Chilton.
Chilton. And then John Alden is the other. Their families are both saying, and the Tilly tradition may also say the first woman, because I can tell you 100% that if they stepped on the rock, it wasn't her, because she wasn't on the exploratory ship.
Right.
And even when they pull into the harbor, a teenage girl's not going to be on the first boat going out to the thing. Is she? If they stepped on the rock, is she the first of the women to do it? Maybe. Assuming they stepped on it, if I had to put money on one particular person doing it, I heard the name over here somewhere, Miles Standish. He's a very much lead from the front guy. And he's going, if not him, one of the unnamed sailors, because he's going to have to secure the boat.
Was there really an actual rock that someone stepped on that's
So
noted?
the Pilgrims do not mention Plymouth Rock at all.
Okay.
That does not mean it didn't happen. Just because you don't write something down doesn't mean it didn't happen, or else a lot of things wouldn't happen. The mythology of Plymouth Rock, the story of Plymouth Rock, does not start until the 18th century, about 120 years after the landing. They are looking to build a wharf over Plymouth Rock. And the elder of the church, Thomas Fonts, comes down to the beach. In some accounts he's carried, in some accounts he walks, but he's 95 years old. And he wants to say goodbye to Plymouth Rock because it's going to be buried, because he had heard from his father, who came over on the Anne, who heard from the original Mayflower passengers. And Fonts could have heard it directly from the original Mayflower passengers, although it would have been very much after the fact, that they had stepped on. Now the problem with Fonts' account is it's not written down at the time. In 1741, I can safely say that Elder Fonts came down and said something about the Pilgrims of the Rock. The written account that we have is from Thatcher's History of Plymouth in 1820. So what exactly? So now we're getting into that game of telephone.
He said, she said.
And what do people remember? Because there's another step in there. So in 1741, Elder Fonts tells the story. Now evidently it does stick with people, because when they do build that wharf, and they do build the wharf in 1749, best we can tell, they actually raise the rock up so that it's not buried by the wharf. Because otherwise, if they built the wharf and covered the rock, none of us, then we would not be having this conversation.
Is it true that the rock was incorporated right into the wharf?
The rock was incorporated right into the wharf, and we have pictures of it later on, of basically a giant flagstone in the wharf. So, in 1769, some people in Plymouth decide to start celebrating the anniversary of the landing of the Pilgrims. We call that day Forefathers' Day. We still celebrate it today. Unfortunately, it's not a paid holiday for the Pilgrim Memorial staff. Actually, we're off at that point in the season anyway.
When is it?
And that is when the story is retold by Deacon Spooner, who was there as a boy, maybe 6 years old, when Fonts told the story in 1741. And then it's written down in 1820 by Thatcher. We got quite the game of telephone here. And this is going back to that forefathers myth. So we have in the early 19th century this resurgence of interest in all things pilgrim. And they really want to push New England, because tourism dollars. We want the fame. Nobody in Virginia is there saying boo. So this story of them stepping on Plymouth Rock really becomes a narrative to help cement the importance of New England. Now, are the Pilgrims important? 100% yes. There are no historians that are going to say the Pilgrims are not important. Would the Pilgrims have been successful if Jamestown had never been settled? Well, odds are they wouldn't have come over, or it would have been a very different set of explorers, because they're coming over because they know it is possible, because Jamestown and the mistakes that they made at Jamestown that they learned from. So even if they did come over here, they wouldn't have the knowledge from those Jamestown settlers. So this story of the rock continues. Now, the rock, in 1774, the people of the town of Plymouth decide to move it. Because, well, it's on a fishing wharf. It's smelly. It's not the best place for this really important symbol, even though we're not a country yet at that point. As they're lifting it up, it breaks in half, top and bottom. Now, the crack that you see in the rock today, a lot of people think that that is the crack from 1774. It is not. There is more of the rock underneath the beach. And that piece of the rock is, that third piece of the rock that you can't see is where it broke in 1774. So the pictures we have from the 19th century are this giant rock in the middle of the wharf. It's actually on somebody's, right in front of some shop. And they bring the top up to town square after probably saying, oops, well, don't hire them as a mover. Later on, it gets brought to the Pilgrim Hall Museum before finally getting brought back down to the waterfront. Now that crack up top, James Baker and I have been going back and forth on this because we've been trying to find evidence of it. There is one story when they're moving the rock to Pilgrim Hall Museum that it falls out of the cart, breaks in half. Oops. Great story, right?
Yeah.
The first time that that story appears in writing is the 60s. 1960s. And this happened over 100 years before that. What we think happened is it was a crack that just was weathering, got worse and worse over the years. And my working theory, and we're starting to find some evidence that this might be true, is when they moved it in 1920 from the old portico so that they could demolish that one and build the new one, they broke it completely on that line and said, it was always like that. Oops. I don't know what you're talking about. There's an interesting newspaper article so fall of 1920, they moved the rock, which broke along its previous split into two pieces. In the spring, when they put it back, the rock, which is now in three pieces. So we're thinking that that's when it happened. But that crack is not from the original move in 1774. But that story of Plymouth Rock, and I'm sure assuming everybody here's been to Plymouth Rock, right? So one of the things I would see fairly frequently at Plymouth Rock, somebody would come into the portico, we're doing that time, good. Put their hands on the railing, lean over. They pause. Really? That's it? I thought it would be so much bigger.
The bolt was really small.
It was bigger. It was probably about twice as big around, as best we could tell. It used to be illegal for people to take hammers and chisels and take souvenirs home. But they did this, and people keep coming to see it today because it is an important symbol. And that mythology around the rock has turned it into that symbol. Does it matter if they stepped on the rock at this point?
No.
Not really. My theory is they used it as a landmark, so as they're coming ashore, they sighted on it so that they could find it again. They could find that spot of the beach again, if they liked it there. And then they landed near to it, but not too near, because you don't want to break your boat. Remember, you might know they had just put ashore in Clark's Island the night before landing there because they had to put a new mast on the shell, the boat that they were exploring in. So they're not going to want to risk breaking open the side of the boat. But that myth of them stepping on the rock, and that rock is really a foundation for not just Plymouth, but for the whole country, really becomes quite the story, even into going into the 300th anniversary. One of the newspaper articles I read said it is, how exactly was it phrased? It is indisputable that they have stepped on this rock. There's not many things, as a historian, that all use that word, indisputable. They were here in 1620, they got here in 1620. But when we talk about little things like that, you're going to see historians hem and haw a lot. And if we're saying something like that, I can back it up with multiple sources. But it's a great story. And all three of these stories, the myth of them coming over for religious freedom, the myths surrounding the first Thanksgiving, the myth of Plymouth Rock, and all the little myths that I've kind of woven in there, have really shaped our country and who we are, what's taught in schools. There's a great book, and I meant to grab it so I could show it off, but it's called Lies My Teacher Told Me. And they just released a new edition, definitely worth picking up. There's a whole chapter on the mythology around this era here. But it does us a disservice when we just buy into these myths. And it does us a disservice for two reasons. One, the original story of the Pilgrims is just as compelling as the myth. When we talk about these people wanting to come over for a better life for their children. And the other reason I forgot to mention, and this is the one religious reason that Bradford mentions, is to bring the word of the gospel to the natives. He says, last but certainly not least, to spread the word of the gospel. That's the only direct mention of religion in his coming over here, although they do call Leiden and Holland in general an ungodly place. Would they have liked to have formed their own perfect religious utopia? Some of them. But that's not the reason. The real reasons of them coming over, if you look at them as people, are super compelling. And we lose that by looking at the myths. And the myths also overwhelm the shared history. Jamestown. Virginia is putting a lot of money into the promotion of Jamestown. They actually put significantly more money into Jamestown 400 than Massachusetts is putting into Plymouth 400. Because they want that story told and they want people aware of it. And Jamestown is a compelling story. They're all compelling stories, and it's not any one thing that really can be tied to starting everything. It's all together. It's all interconnected. And by really propagating these myths, we overwhelm not just the true story of what happened on the small scale, but we ignore some of the other things. And that's the natives as well, the Wampanoag, their long history here. The Narragansett, the Massachusetts, all of the tribes in this area that made up the Wampanoag, their shared history. All of that gets overlooked. One of the things when I do my rock talk at the Rock, obviously, we bring up the natives. And one of the things that I love the most about that portion of the talk, when I talk about how the different native groups are impacted, is I see people doing this. And I get multiple people every week coming up and thanking me for sharing that part of the story, because if we look at the mythology, it removes them.
Yeah, but wouldn't you agree that by us coming here from England was the beginning of the end for the Native Americans? I mean,
As they do
that
it.
was
They're still here. They're still here today.
Yeah,
But their lifestyle is way new.
estimated 10 million Native Americans in this country.
Yeah.
And in 1900, there was 100,000 left.
It's,
Didn't it all start right here?
It's even before the Pilgrims, because the disease that killed so many of
Came
the...
from the French and Canada.
We think the main one that happened in 1616 was a trader in Maine.
Yes.
So Maine, it could have been English. But that all gets overwhelmed. So as fun as it can be to share these myths, I ask you to take them with a grain of salt, but also look into true stories yourselves. I can only in this 45-minute, talk or so tell you so much about the myths and about the true stories. So look up that book, Lies My Teacher Told Me. If you want to look up some of the smaller and the more fun myths, there's a great book called Death by Petticoat. And that is about the myth of the leading cause of death among women in colonial times was their petticoats catching fire. It wasn't.
I have a question also.
Let me just finish my... I'll get to questions in a second. But by doing that, and by sharing those true stories with everybody else, we are doing the true history justice. And while it can be fun to start with the myth, and you absolutely do it, but use those myths as a starting point, and don't just end with them. So, thank you very much. I'll be here to take questions, but I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In Jamestown, they weren't known as pilgrims, correct? But
Correct.
in Plymouth, they were known as pilgrims. What was the difference? I mean, or...
The terminology of pilgrims for the group up here does come out of Bradford. He mentions it once, and they were called pilgrims, and that just kind of took off from there. It's in the 19th century that term starts to be used. Before the 19th century, it's Forefathers' Day. They were known as the Forefathers. And Jamestown, I'm trying to think if there is even really a name for the first comers is used up here as well. I'd have to double check with my friends at Jamestown if there is like one catch-all term that's used. The thing with Jamestown is very few people who were on the original 3 ships survived. So they're not venerated the way the Pilgrims are. When we look at the Pilgrims, how many people here are descendants of somebody from the Mayflower? Better than half the room. When we look at who's descended from one of those original 3 ships, I'm sure that there's some around, but not very many. So that's part of the impact too, is the Mayflower descendants are still here and they want their ancestors to look good.
So is Pilgrim like a religious follower or something? Is that
The term pilgrim is just somebody, prior to that, somebody going somewhere on a religious pilgrimage. So typically you're going to a holy site to venerate or to see, to ask for a prayer. Somebody needs to be healthy, or you want good crops or something like that. Or you want to be forgiven for your sins. And somebody going to one of those sites, it's a pilgrimage, and so they're called pilgrims. And Bradford mentions that once. He uses that word once. And that kind of just took off.
I have a question. Is part of the rock at the Smithsonian?
So the question is part of the rock at the Smithsonian? Parts of the rock are all over the world, and yes, the Smithsonian does have
On
a part.
display at the Smithsonian?
As far as I know, it's on display. They have several pieces. They have a sister piece to what's on display at the Pilgrim Hall Museum. That piece there, when they built the original portico, I think that they moved the rock when they built the foundation. We don't have a lot of information on it. Either way, the portico is too small for the rock. Instead of making the portico bigger, they made the rock smaller. I can't make this stuff up. The truth is better than the myths. One of these pieces that we chopped off from the bottom is actually on the Forefathers Monument. Faith's left foot is standing on a piece of Plymouth Rock, so if you look at the Forefathers Monument. This other piece, it looks like some guy took it home with him, and it was the doorstep of the old Harlow House. And when the Antiquarian Society took over the property, they found the rock. I don't know who made the connection.
This is not a myth.
This is not a myth. This is not a myth. They did some geological testing. Rocks are unique. They have their own fingerprints. And they figured out that this was part of Plymouth Rock. And they broke that up. Pilgrim Hall Museum got part of it. Smithsonian got a part.
Yes. So when did they put the 1620s?
When did they put the 1620s? Yeah, that's how they knew. The etching was done
That's how they found the rock.
in.
That's how those people were supposed to land there.
I guess.
Oh my God! It was first painted on when it was on the front lawn of the Pilgrim Hall Museum in the early 1800s. 1880, when they moved it back down there, is when they carved it in. Unless I'm really forgetting wrong, because I know it wasn't 1920. That's too late. It's been a while since I've answered some of these questions. Story of Squanto Chisquantum is an interesting story. Going back, actually, it used to be believed that he had been to England twice, that he had been taken over as a boy voluntarily and then kidnapped later on. Incidentally, the person who kidnapped him was here with Captain John Smith. It was the captain of the other ship that Smith was here with, and Smith left early and said, all right, you're going to do one more trade, then come back, and he kidnapped Squanto and some other 28 other native peoples. Squanto's story, I wish we had more details on it. And it's the fact that we know as much as we do on some of it amazes me. But he did essentially try to use the Pilgrims as a tool to overthrow Massasoit.
That's what
Massasoit demands that Squanto be handed over to him. And by the treaty that the Pilgrims have with him, they're obligated to do that. And after they refuse, Massasoit could have attacked. There is some speculation among historians, and I don't know how widespread it is. I think it was Philbrick that first published it in Mayflower, and there's a number of inaccuracies in there that you need to be careful when reading, although it's a very easy read. He's the one, I believe, that first speculates that Massasoit had him poisoned.
Had a what?
Poisoned.
Okay.
Did that happen? I don't know. I mean, Squanto had lived in London for a couple years and not gotten sick and died, so him just all of a sudden falling sick and dying from a European disease is kind of convenient. And you don't want somebody running around who's going to try and overthrow you. But we don't know. We just know that a few months after all of this went down, Squanto was on a trading mission with Bradford down on the Cape, and after a couple days in one of the villages, he fell ill and died.
My own thought was that maybe the Pilgrims poisoned him because they were in a tough spot. Massasoit, they didn't want to aggravate Massasoit and have him attack his tribe. But on the other hand, Squanto, they wouldn't have survived without him. So
Right.
if they handed him back, they knew they would be handing him to be executed. And they went on a trip down Cape, I think, to bring back a boy who got lost or something. And I wondered if it was an easy way out for the Pilgrims that he died.
I don't-
They didn't have to.
I don't think that.
You know-
I don't think Bradford would do that, because Bradford risked Massasoit attacking him when he said no.
He did say no.
And Bradford actually speaks very highly of Squanto in his journal. Of course,
Oh, yeah.
that's Bradford, and we've got to take what he writes with a grain of salt, because he's going to make himself and the Pilgrims look good, because he's writing for perpetuity. I think I don't think that happened, but that's just educated guess on
Do
my
we
part.
know where he's buried down Cape? We don't.
No.
Just.
I'm not aware. Thank you guys very much.